Damaged Defenders by Scherza, Sif and Charles. It took but a few moments for Sif, Frigga, and the Warriors 3 to get their feet under them once they were deposited on Svartalfheim's landing zone. Svartalfheim, like all of the older realms, had long ago ensured that any Bifrost visitors could not land anywhere they pleased. It gave the residents of the realms plenty of warning of an invading force arriving by that means, and time to mount a defense. That was why Thor and company had not been able to transport themselves into Laufey's very throne room, but had to land well outside of the Jotun city capital and go the rest of the way on foot. That was why Asgard's control room had been at the far end of a long, narrow, literal rainbow road. As there had been little call in Asgard for the sorts of weapons the dwarves of Svartalfheim specialized in, nor had their people been at war at any point in living memory, Sif had never actually been to Svartalfheim. Thus she took her time looking about her. Svartalfheim, like Asgard and Jotunheim, and very much unlike Vanaheim and Midgard, had mostly one environment. In Svartalfheim's case, it was tall, rugged, stony mountains as far as the eye could see. There was a marked lack of horizontal real estate, and little in the way of greenery save tufts of grass, occasional shrubs, and the rare, shrunken, wind-twisted tree. Thanks to the altitude, it was nigh as cold and windy in the landing zone as it had been on Jotunheim. Little wonder, Sif reflected, that this realm's people had resorted to carving homes and livelihoods out of the rock. They'd had no other truly viable option. Svartalfheim did not seem to have a guardian at the landing zone the way Asgard did. Sif, however, wasn't about to take that at face value. Not after seeing Jotuns clamber out of apparently randomly placed blocks of ice, with even Loki, who had ever been the most likely to spot such trickery, caught unawares. For all she knew, they were currently surrounded. Clearly the warriors were of like mind, as they had moved swiftly to surround their queen and Sleipnir, faces and weapons turned outwards to their surroundings. Sif was aware of the fact that this was rather like a group of cubs attempting to protect a pair of adult wolves, but she could no more stop herself than the warriors could. Volstagg, I believe you know the way, Frigga asked after everyone had had a few moments to assess their surroundings. Volstagg, while not as old as Frigga and Odin, was far closer to their ages than he was to the rest of Thor's group of friends. He was, after all, married and had several children himself, though all three of them were quite young yet. The youngest was barely out of swaddling. As a result, he traveled and done more than the rest of the company. It made sense that he had been here once before. Aye, my queen, Volstagg said. He immediately took point, leading the way down a narrow, twisty path that led to no destination that Sif could see. Sif automatically took Frigga's left flank, while Fandral, the unapologetic flirt, took the queen's right and Hogan brought up the rear. Sif made a bet with herself as to how long it would take for Fandral to forget himself and attempt to flirt with the queen. The results bid fair to be highly amusing. Sif sincerely doubted that Frigga would take legitimate offense, but by the same token, Sif was fairly sure that Frigga would not let any flirting go by unremarked. They picked their careful way down the path for the better part of 2 hours. Sif knew the journey would not have taken quite so long if the road had been less treacherous. As it was, she was heartily thankful for having her mount beneath her. Her gelding was far more sure-footed on such terrain than Sif ever would be. She was beginning to believe the dwarves were part goat to traverse such paths without assistance. Eventually, they made their way to a mostly horizontal part of the path, then negotiated a sharp turn. And there, as abruptly as if they'd been conjured, were a pair of thick metal doors currently flung wide open to welcome any arrivals. The doors were only just barely tall enough to admit Frigga aboard Sleipnir. Sif had a feeling that Odin, who was a good bit taller than his wife, would have had to duck to get through the door if he had been riding Sleipnir. It was just within that door, in a deliberately, Sif was a touch too late to realize, dim, dark room that they were approached. More like surrounded. When Sif's vision finally adjusted to the gloom, she got a first good look at the dwarf. The tallest of them would barely come to Sif's collarbone. They all had close shorn hair and beards, and were dressed in thick, well-worn leather and mail armor. They were also all armed to the teeth. Sif could see axes, hammers, and swords in ready evidence, but no weapons were actively being pointed at their company. She glanced behind them and frowned when she realized that several dwarves had appeared behind Hogan, somehow or other. One of the dwarves stepped forward, which caused Sleipnir to flick his ears back and give a displeased-sounding grunt and dance on his feet briefly in a blatant warning. Simultaneously, Volstagg shifted, turning his own mount slightly broadside, his sword and sword hand turned towards the approaching dwarf so he could defend his queen, if such became necessary. The dwarf stopped instantly, nodding respectfully. "Forgive our caution, Queen Frigga. Disturbing rumors have reached our ears of late, and it was judged wise to be wary." Frigga gave the dwarf a regal nod. "No forgiveness is needed, honorable dwarf. To protect one's realm is any being's sacred duty. I know not what rumors have reached your keen ears, but I dare say I may be able to clarify matters. I have need to speak with your king." The dwarf bowed. "Of course, Queen Frigga." He turned to one of the others. "The light!" The second dwarf walked over to one wall and touched something that Sif could not see clearly in the gloom. Seconds later, the room brightened considerably. It was not as bright as Asgard's halls, but that would have been impossible to accomplish given they were underground. Still, she had no problem seeing clearly in the much brightened light. The cave room they were in was fairly large, roughly 100 feet long and wide, and had several entrances, each guarded by thick metal doors. She could see long corridors through some of the doors, clearly leading deeper into the mountain. She presumed the other doors that she could not see, though as clearly, due to the angle she was at in relation to them, were much the same. There seemed to be metal rails embedded in the floor of the corridors. For what reason, she was not immediately sure. "If you would be kind enough to follow me, I will show you where you may leave your mounts," the dwarf that had first spoken to them said. They trailed after him to a door on the far right-hand side. The corridor here was shorter than she expected, and led to a truly enormous stable, though this one was filled with horses that were closer to being ponies in size compared to Asgardian mounts. Sleipnir let out a whinny that was clearly laughter when he saw the stalls. Sif didn't blame him. The tallest stall door she could see would barely reach the bottom of his chest. Some of them wouldn't reach his knees. The dwarf led them into another section of the stable. This section had clearly been built with visitors in mind. The stalls were built to accommodate the larger horses of other realms, and clearly Sleipnir had been here fairly frequently, as there was a stall big enough to accommodate him. They all dismounted and removed their mounts' tack, then followed the dwarf back out. Sif soon discovered the reason for the metal rails. The dwarves traveled on them in carts of varying descriptions. The reason that was required quickly became clear. There must have been thousands of miles of track beneath just the one mountain, with crossroads scattered at unpredictable intervals. Thankfully, the lot was brightly lit, but that would do an invading force little good. The dwarves' underground home was a bewildering labyrinth a body could wander in for days without finding anything of consequence. In the last week or so, in between his resumed therapy sessions with Jean, lessons with the children, and the various work required of him to keep the school running well, Charles had been putting together a list of people he could contact to, at the very least, forewarn of the coming conflict. Ideally, he'd like to get some or all of them on side with the defense of the planet, but there was sadly no guarantee there. Charles' list was surprisingly small. The list of adult mutants was fairly short. It wouldn't be in 5 years' time. There was a bumper crop of mutants in their mid to late teens currently, but that wasn't going to do them any good in the coming confrontation that Tony had warned him about. The list of adult mutants who had not gone lawless at best or become enemies of humankind at worst was even shorter. The people on that list who had established themselves as protectors of any kind and thus had experience in combat was even shorter. Charles just hoped that when the time came, it would be enough. Formidable as the Avengers and the X-Men might be, they didn't have a hope of defending the entire planet if Thanos attacked on multiple fronts. Having put together a list of those most likely to be willing to fight in defense of the planet, Charles had set aside today to begin calling them and informing them of the upcoming situation. There was also one call he planned to make for Tony's sake, and that one he decided to make first. He punched in the number. The phone was picked up on the second ring.
Hello, this is Dr. Xavier. If you would be so kind as to inform Dr. Reyes, I need to speak with her.
He asked of the secretary that answered the phone. Moments later, he was transferred.
Cecilia, it's delightful to speak to you. How are things going?
He asked. Slow, Cecilia said. The clinic's been fairly quiet lately. I heard you had some excitement last week in your neck of the woods. Everyone okay? Cecilia asked.
Quite. Though that incident is tangentially related to why I'm calling you, Charles admitted. The other team that was defending the city during that fight is in dire need of a capable doctor who can deal with, shall we say, unusual physiologies, Charles told her.
I'll say, Cecilia said. There's, one totally unaltered human in the lot?
Quite,
Charles said. That one human being Clint Martin. Even Tony at this point qualified as altered due to the arc reactor in his chest. Give me a number to contact them and I'll see if we suit each other, Cecilia said. Heaven knows they'll keep me busy if they're in the hero business.
Charles laughed a little shakily. More than you know, Cecilia. The fight we won isn't over.
There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line. Oh dear. How long do we have?
Roughly a year, Charles admitted. I'm going to be on the phone all day, warning as many as I think will take it seriously.
I'll spread the word through my network too, Cecilia promised. It's more grassroots than yours, but every bit will help.
Precisely, and my thanks, Charles told her.
Then he gave her Tony's number and said his goodbyes. The next on his list was a quartet of people in the UK and Western Europe. Of the four, Pete Wisdom was Charles' most tenuous contact. Betsy Braddock, Sean Cassidy, and Moira McTaggart were all longtime friends. Sean and Moira longer than Betsy by a good bit. Sean's daughter was currently attending Charles' school. She was attending less to learn to control her power, which was identical to her father's, which had enabled him to teach her what she needed to know in very short order, and more to have a school experience free of the kind of danger a mutant could face in your average school. Moira and Betsy had quite the range of contacts in their respective fields, which would widen the warning net considerably. The next call Charles made was to Wakanda and its reigning sovereign. T'Challa had only very recently taken his place as ruler in the wake of his father's death, but he was a good man and would not hesitate to protect his people. The next quartet of calls went to Jean-Paul Barbier, one of Charles' most dependable Canadian contacts, Carol Danvers, who in the Air Force and currently based out of Nellis Air Force Base, Sam Guthrie, who would mobilize his rather extensive and nearly all mutant family and their not inconsiderable good old boy network in the South, and John Proudstar, who would be able to rally the remnants of the North American Indian tribes. Those were the easy calls. Every last one of them were quick to affirm their support and their intentions to mobilize as many of the people they knew as they possibly could. Unfortunately, the remaining calls Charles had to make would be far more fraught. While none of the people on the list were enemies, or even inclined to evil, his relations with them were not as congenial as his relations with the people he had spoken to thus far. The first on the list was perhaps the easiest to convince, if the most antagonistic. Emma Frost and he had never really gotten along. He did not approve at all of her lack of morals, and she considered him a naive prude, both physically and mentally. That said, she wouldn't hesitate to fight if it meant not having alien overlords. The next one was going to be tricky all around. Shiro Yoshida was up to the ears in the sort of arrogance that was convinced no one would dare to cause him or sully the sanctity of his homeland, and the poor fools that did would be rightfully put in their place with a minimum of effort thanks to his and his homeland's inherent superiority. Fortunately, in this case, Charles had an easy enough way to shut him up. Even if Shiro and Japan were everything he claimed, If the rest of the world fell, they'd be sunk, and would eventually fall. It would be inevitable, if for no other reason than the country had a finite number of citizens and would eventually bleed itself dry trying to stay free. And Shiro was not immortal. That particular call took a full hour to complete to Charles' satisfaction. Shiro had been less than pleased, but had ultimately agreed that in this case working with outsiders was for the best. The next three on his list were, well, more painful personally than anything else to deal with. They were Eric's children, Pietro, Wanda, and Lorna. Though none of the three bore his last name, of course, which at this point was for the best. It made it more difficult for anyone to realize they were his children and attempt to paint them with the same brush as Eric. Charles had kept a casual eye on them after he and Eric had parted ways, mostly to make sure they didn't get into trouble they couldn't get out of. All three of them had been cautious, but willing to take Charles' warning to heart and do what they could to prepare to defend at least themselves, if not those around them. Lorna, the youngest, was the least tainted by her father's bitterness, and the most likely to join forces with some group or other, and likely to do the most good, as she had inherited Eric's mutation, if not Eric's sheer power. Yet. Those calls made, Charles sat and stared at the phone for nearly an hour as he waffled about making one more call. This one, if he made it, would by far be the most dangerous call, because he could predict what the person on the other end of the call would do in response to the warning. If he warned her, Mystique would head straight for Eric and free him. And God knew having Eric free and fighting would swing the odds heavily in the favor of Earth. Eric's mutation, power, and control made him one of the most formidable mutants on the planet. But Eric was broken, and as likely to try to subjugate Earth as the Chitauri and this Thanos character was, once the fight was won. Eventually, Charles decided not to make the call. He would work on Eric instead, try to get him to see reason. Maybe ask the captain if he would do likewise. If Eric was going to listen to anyone, it might be Steve. For now, Eric would remain incarcerated. If he was still intransient when the fight came and they were losing, Charles would have no compunctions about freeing him and dealing with the fallout, but hopefully it wouldn't come to that.